Stake Knife, otherwise Freddie Scappaticci, has achieved a notoriety in death that probably matches his reputation within Republican and British Army circles for violence and for double dealing during his active career as a British Army agent within the Provisional IRA. Suffice to say that he had been in that role for the British Army and other British agencies for a long number of years. But from about 1990 on, he was compromised as a result of an investigation in Belfast. And then over the succeeding years, he was effectively dropped by the British as an active agent because his cover had been blown. But he was not outed, at least in the public mind, until 2003 by a newspaper reporter. And eventually he was, many years later, in 2016, he became the subject of Operation Kenova. And that was set up under the Chief Constable Jon Boutcher, and it was to investigate the crimes of this individual, the allegations made against them, and the capacity and the implications for collusion by members of the British security apparatus with him, and in turn the crimes that he committed on their behalf and the murders that he committed as being part of the internal disciplinary squad of the Provisional IRA, the so-called Nutting Squad. So Jon Boutcher, via the Chief Constable of the PSNI, got that job to do. Now, Mr. Boutcher was then a Chief Constable of the British Police with a very creditable record of investigations behind him. That was in 2016. Chief Constable of the PSNI then added in something called Operation Mizzenmast, was the murder of Jean Smith Campbell in 1972. Operation Terma, an investigation into the murder of 3 IUC officers at Kenega Embankment in 1982. And then subsequently something called the Barnard Review. Now that's quite different, that is meant to be an analytical report on collusion in what has become known as the Glenanne series. Now that is quite different from an investigation. Glenanne was a gang of loyalist killers operating collusion with members of the security force, particularly active in Armagh or South Armagh, and that was added into the task that Mr. Boutcher had as dealing with Operation Kenova. So all of that, part of that, was just recently reported on by the Public Prosecution Service of Northern Ireland. And in relation to the first significant criminal investigation at this stage, Freddie Scappaticci, Stake Knife, had died, and there were remaining files involving a number of other individuals for which the Public Prosecution Service ruled there was no evidence that would justify or would have a reasonable prospect of prosecution. So that is more or less up to the present. Clearly the Public Prosecution Service of Northern Ireland took a decision not to prosecute 16 individuals who had been investigated under the remit of Operation Kenova. And of course, Stake Knife, now deceased, was the central figure in all of that. And again, for reasons that we can easily recognise, he was the one that everyone looked forward to seeing before the courts and the evidence that he would be adduced against them. The Public Prosecution Service made a simple, straightforward and final determination. There was insufficient evidence to provide a reasonable prospect of conviction. And we see here a list of the different individuals who were brought before or who were investigated as part of Kenova, and the different ones, and this included police officers and military personnel. The bottom line is that one understands the obvious difficulty in investigating and subsequently prosecuting anything of a historical nature, and particularly in the contentious cauldron of Northern Ireland in finding witnesses able to come forward. It's also appropriate to understand that any good police investigator or any legal advisor to the police would have recognised very early on that this was an exercise that was going nowhere in terms of a day in court, relating to all of these horrible crimes. The other item of interest is, of course, assuming that there is insufficient to provide a reasonable prospect of conviction. That doesn't mean to say that a lot of information and intelligence was gained. in the course of the investigation. So now, what is to become of that intelligence? Will it be made available to the victims of the families, the families of the victims? Will it be made available to them? Will it be available for civil proceedings, or will it be barred by the British Legacy Act, which effectively bars everything from early next year that occurred before 1998? So there's a real question over the corollary of the information collected, not court quality, but certainly would be very revealing in terms of the overall background to all of these activities, including those of Stake Knife. Let me say very unequivocally that Freddie Scappaticci, who's pictured here on the top left, was the British agent known as Stake Knife. This was the code name given him while he operated on behalf of different interests on the British intelligence side, including operating with a unit called the FRU, the Force Research Unit, and many other aspects of British intelligence, and of course the other organisations within the system like MI5, etc. So he was well embedded within the Provisional IRA, and he was one of the key individuals involved in their so-called internal disciplinary squad, feared by many within that organisation, and they had been responsible for many deaths and, as they would term it, executions of informants or so-called informants. So quite a savage, blood-stained record at the behest of this man and the people that he cooperated with. And he was, and this is an irreducible truth, he was clearly embedded within the Provisional IRA for all of that time, and in a position to convey information back to his handlers in the British system, as he no doubt did. And it is obvious that he was left free to run for many years. And of course it wasn't until 2016, when Kenova was launched, that any formal legal system or investigation had been taken in regard to his criminal activities. Now, this is quite unbelievable, because for as far back as 1990, his involvement would have been known by other aspects of the criminal justice system as distinct from the military, in terms of his use as an agent of the British. And he managed to survive, and survive being a very operative word, even survived being outed in the media in 2003. And eventually he was to surface many years later as a person of interest in the Smithick Tribunal, which started in 2005. This was the tribunal that Judge Peter Smithick, that you see on the bottom right of the first caption, as we look at it, chaired. It started in 2005, and its mission was to inquire into suggestions of collusion by members of the Garda Síochána in the murders of Chief Superintendent Harry Breen and Superintendent Bob Buchanan in 1989. Now, Scappaticci did not give evidence before that tribunal, but he was allowed to retain lawyers at the expense of the Irish state. And those lawyers, believe it or not, were paid €382,270 to represent his interests, so he could deny that he was a Stake Knife. Quite incredible. Now, in this material is a photograph of Peter Keeley, Kevin Fulton. Now, not germane to our particular story here, other than to say he also was a former British Army soldier who had infiltrated the IRA in Newry and in Dundalk and that general area, and he became a star witness at the Smithick Tribunal. And this man was and is an acknowledged liar, and some of that admission from out of his own mouth. So you can see that there was quite a cast of characters operating in the dark and murky war in the north. Now, all of this is about collusion, and collusion is the centre of this, and we will see very shortly that there was a widespread use of the collusive activity of state actors in enabling other loyalist paramilitaries to murder and to create mayhem in the Republican or nationalist ranks. Now, it should be said that the Provisional IRA were no shrinking violets, and they wreaked havoc and murder where they could on their targets as well. Operation Kenova was directed by the former Chief Constable Jon Boutcher from 2016 up to very recent times, which he has now taken up an appointment, rather incredibly, as the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland. So I guess his direct association with Operation Kenova doesn't continue, although the Office of Chief Constable in Northern Ireland has a key role in deciding on the action that will be taken on the foot of the conclusions of Kenova. However, that is a dilemma for another day. It is clear that there is proven collusion in Northern Ireland to a grand scale. And rather than making any of the assertions myself or going back down through to rely on Sir John Stevens. He is now Lord Stevens, as in the House of Lords, and he was a former commissioner of the Metropolitan Police in London, and he was given the responsibility in 1989 of investigating the issue of collusion in Northern Ireland, and he operated for close on 10 years with 3 separate inquiries. His report was not published, but we have on record and can see in view a statement that he made to a select committee in the Houses of Parliament in London when he was asked about the extent of collusion that he had encountered in the course of his inquiries. And he answered in a very direct way by indicating the areas that he found evidence of collusion on the principal actors on that side. But the critical phrase he used, which we see on our screen, his team had arrested 210 individuals. His team had arrested 210 individuals, and only 3 were not agents. Only 3 were not agents. Frankly, I don't think there's any need for me to continue to make the case that collusion was rampant in the North. That collusion was rampant in the North, with very serious consequences for the individuals involved. Of course, there were many, many individual officers and intelligence operatives who were not part of that collusive circle, but certainly there is no doubt that there was a significant element that thrived in that particular milieu. I think we can accept also as a matter of operating certainty that the British policy was that if circumstances allowed it, they would want to cap off the oil well of legacy and collusion. And indeed their legacy bill or legacy act that went through Parliament earlier on this year is proof that they intend to drop the barrier on any Troubles-related crimes committed prior to 1998. So there is a clear attempt to close off and to move on. It is very appropriate that the question would be asked, what does the future hold for Operation Kenova? In other words, does it have a future? Is it reasonable to expect, considering the effluxion of time and the difficulty in getting evidence of a court quality, that it can go anywhere in achieving that goal of putting the culprits responsible before a court? And that's something obviously will become clear over the next while. You'll see on your screen that I've made 2 mentions to crimes committed in Southern Ireland, and that is the Dublin Monaghan bombings of 1974 and the murder of the unfortunate County Louth farmer in 1991, which had elements of cross-border. But again, Mr. Oliver was abducted in the south. His body was found a short time later in the north. Now, I'm mystified as to how both of these 2 crimes appear under Jon Boutcher's Operation Kenova because of the issue of jurisdiction, apart from anything else. Mr. Boutcher has said himself very clearly that he doesn't have jurisdiction in the south. And so I'm really mystified from a purely practical point of view as to what they do, why they are part of his overall Operation Kenova. But I will make this point is that I know from experience, and I've said this to Mr. Boutcher and his team, that if one is very seriously investigating crimes that have a cross-border dimension, the obvious and only way to investigate them is to set up a cross-border investigation team. In other words, a joint investigation team. And then go about the business of investigating the different leads in the parallel jurisdictions, putting it together and agreeing a strategy for bringing that information before the courts, either north or south, or in both jurisdictions. Because there are very definite rules in evidence gathering in relation to what information or evidence can be used as found in one jurisdiction but pertains to another. Very simple rules. But the idea that this becomes a kind of a political football, or becomes a manner of making a point or pointing a finger, is not the productive way of doing it. Now, we know that Mr. Boutcher gave an interview in the South some time ago in relation to the Tom Oliver murder, and he was quite critical, at least of some Gardaí, and he was hoping that they would cooperate fully with him. Now, that is certainly not helpful. It would be the same as somebody from the South standing in a field in Northern Ireland and appealing to the retired members of the RUC or the PSNI to come forward and help with an inquiry. This is not simply the way to do business. It's not the way to achieve cooperation. As I said, joint investigation team, properly resourced, legally sound, and properly led is the way to do anything of that kind. Anything else other than that leaves a very uncomfortable taste in the mouth. Just a short few minutes ago, I was speculating as to what is the future for Kenova, or does it have a future? And of course, I am now more mystified than ever to share with you, these recent developments, and then some not so recent. Jon Boutcher, as we see here, was the head of Operation Kenova from 2016 and right up to a short few weeks ago. And he has now been appointed the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland. Now, this is extraordinary, puzzling, hard to understand. One of the significant reasons is that when Mr. Boutcher was appointed, it was through the office of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, i.e. the Chief Constable, to look into the area surrounding the Stake Knife Freddie Scappaticci. Now, Freddie Scappaticci is dead, so that part of the investigation is over. So we have a strange position now that Mr. Boutcher is in the seat that he would himself have reported into with regard to what the future held for the information collected over his long investigation period. So this is quite an interesting situation for Jon Boutcher. Now, just to move forward, last year, a conference was held in the US, and it featured Jon Boutcher and Maria MacDonald, who is a Monaghan lady, a lawyer, an academic, and somebody who is directly involved in looking at the victims and the consequences of victims of crime, and also has a very interesting view on the legislation that was introduced by the British Parliament, British government, to limit the prosecution of criminal offences committed before 1998. In other words, that there would be no criminal prosecutions from a specific date in 2014. This was a conference attended by both people, and there was an interesting exchanges between them. And in the course of that, Mr. Boutcher made some comments about the Dublin and Monaghan bombings and the memorial to the victims and its location in Dublin, which I can only say was quite unhelpful and a little bit surprising in the overall context. Now, Dublin Monaghan is a very serious business, and there are, as I've said before, very compelling reasons to believe that even if it were the Glenanne gang who were involved in it, they didn't have the technical capacity to do it, to launch 3 bombs in Dublin within 4 minutes. They hadn't done it before, and they certainly didn't do it since. As a matter of fact, their bombing campaigns was more characterized by bungling, like the Miami Showband, than the technical efficiency that was shown in Dublin. So I'm a bit surprised at Mr. Boutcher's comments in relation to that. But that's for another day. Essentially now the question is what happens between the different parties involved, and really does it do anything to recover or discover, and what it offers for the victims will be very, very interesting, because obviously one of the products that would look for would have been criminal prosecutions of individuals involved in the Stake Knife investigation. But of course he is no longer with us, and we have seen earlier what the Public Prosecution Service has said in relation to other individuals who have been charged. But the other product, of course, is the information and intelligence that came from all of that work from 2016. Now, I'm assuming that that information will go to the other Jon Boutcher, who is now the Chief Constable of the PSNI. All of that intelligence, all of that information will wind up in his desk, obviously in the authorities in Whitehall as well. So what is he now going to do with that information? Is he going to be able to interact with the families of the victims as he would have done as head of Kenova? So these are very interesting and open questions. I really hadn't planned to get involved in any great depth on the Dublin and Monaghan car bombings of the because the 50th anniversary is due in 2024, and obviously there should be a real reasoned fact-based debate leading up to that, indeed well in advance of the 17th of May 2024. But Mr. Boutcher's comments just simply, I guess, raised a warning light in terms of their brevity and their lack of contextual understanding to an audience, to an American audience in relation to the Dublin and Monaghan bombings. I just want to make it clear that it's very, very important in all of these northern events that impacted on the Southern Ireland is to understand the context. And the context for Dublin and Monaghan was the Sunningdale Agreement, the first power-sharing agreement that had been instituted in Northern Ireland, and the result of the Dublin and Monaghan bombings was that Sunningdale Agreement, the power-sharing executive, was stood down within a very short length of time. There was incredible protest within the Loyalist and Unionist community in the north to the Sunningdale Agreement, and the Ulster workers went on strike, and the province was brought to its knees in terms of the infrastructure and the movement. Yes, there are questions about the follow-up to the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, but those questions apply equally to the UK government as they do to the Irish government. And it really is a matter for looking at the information, and there is very detailed information available that took a long time to discover, and in the future and leading in, I'm really looking forward to having a proper debate. Now, I've written long and hard about the Dublin and Monaghan car bombings for a long number of years because I didn't like the narrative that was used in Dublin by the Dublin government on the anniversary of these horrendous events, that if only the British would share their information, then it would be a lot easier on the victims. And there is an element of truth in that, but there's also questions to be answered politically in Dublin as to why for many years there was very little reaction, probably none, in relation to the information that the British Prime Minister gave to the Irish Taoiseach in 1974 on 2 occasions. We know who committed the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, and we have interned them. We know who have committed the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, and we have interned them. Now, there is a great debate that should happen and involve North, South and East in relation to all of that, and certainly a one-liner at a transatlantic venue doesn't do it justice.